There we go. Connor, can you hear me? There
I
are
can use
so
mine.
there are so many people in here. I think we crashed foul. Uh, that's a good thing. It's nice to see everybody's face this morning. Connor, I want to jump right in. I'm 5 minutes late, and this is our secondary chat because we ran out of time last time. So I want to pick up. Last time we talked a lot about your career over the course of behavioral science. For those that have never been to a fireside chat like this, we generally do just jump in. It's just Connor and I having a chat. If you have questions, go ahead and just leave them in as comments or in the shared notes, and he and I will get to them. Connor, where I want to pick up a little bit is some of the organizational work that you've done around recognizing and organizing the field. So, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the trade industry that you are a part of and beliefs and those sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So before that, I'll just quickly reintroduce myself in case there's anybody new here. So Connor Joyce, behavioral scientist of about 5 years now. I've worked at Microsoft, a company called Tonal, it's like strength training of Peloton, and then most recently a company called Twilio, which is the back end for communications for pretty much everything these days, technical. But yeah, so on the side, since my master's program, I've been working on something that initially was called the Behavioral Insights Professional Society, BIPS. I think that's when Matt, you and I first connected, what I was calling it. And then we rebranded about 3 years ago to the Applied Behavioral Science Association. And so it's been an on and off work stream with many different folks since then, all with the intention of just trying to add more definition to the field of applied behavioral science. And so, what does that actually mean? I think that the reoccurring themes that I hear is, first of all, that there's a lot of different pathways that someone can get into behavioral science, but not all of them are going to bring the same level of skills and knowledge to how people apply quote unquote behavioral science to whatever work is being done. And so we wanted to just add some definition around what is the ideal types of knowledge, skills, and abilities that someone's going to have if they build themselves as a behavioral scientist. So that's what we call the standards. Uh, from the standards, we have many different ideas of how else we can both then build a pipeline for people to build those KSAs. Again, if I say KSAs, it's knowledge, skills, and abilities. So that's one work stream. We've also talked about how we could go out and either work with other training organizations and other knowledge granting institutions. That could be universities, that could be, again, training programs, boot camps, et cetera, to enable people to get certified. So take those standards and be able to add some authenticity behind it by saying somebody got the required skills, again, KSAs. Um, so that's another work stream. And then the third thing is just community building. And for a while, we spent a lot of our time on that. And I actually think that that's the most saturated part of the market right now. There's a fair amount of good communities that one can join now that you can meet other people who are trying to apply behavioral science. I know BeSci.io is one of them that's being built. There's also groups like Action Design Network that has chapters in many different cities. A few others that are out there. But anyway, so again, Applied Behavioral Science Association, something that's been being built on for about 5 years now, really 3 core years of the ABSA. A lot of that time was spent in community building. We, about a year ago, decided that we were going to postpone or suspend that and instead focus on the standards. And so that's what we've been working on for the last year. I was actually just this morning emailing some people. We're probably about a month away from deploying that. So that is going to be a big milestone for us. We've been collecting feedback from leaders across the industry, while also opening up to folks, just like all of you, to contribute. What do you think an applied behavioral scientist is? So yeah, I'll leave it there. But the last thing, just saying, if anybody is interested in providing feedback, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Connect Connor as my handle on LinkedIn. You also can message here if you can message, and I should be able to add you to or send you the form to fill out to get access.
So let's dive in there because there's a lot in there. First of all, why did you even start a trade organization? Like, what did you feel like wasn't happening in the network? Like, where did this sort of happen for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think so. I see Jared Peterson's on here too. He was one of my masters of behavioral and decision sciences classmates. Hopefully you sympathize or empathize with what I'm going to say, and if not, please feel free to check me. But I think that we were the second cohort of the program at UPenn, and now I think they're in their fifth or sixth cohort. I think it is sixth cohort. And all of us came in very excited, coming from different areas. Some people just found behavioral science through their undergrad. Other people like me found it through reading books, and then was trying to apply it in my job when I was at Deloitte. And then there's other people who really had been applying behavioral science and then just needed to add some authenticity. So there's, again, people coming from a lot of different directions. And I think the most common mistake that I saw people make in that program was thinking that the program was going to be like an MBA. So UPenn has Wharton. Wharton obviously is an outstanding MBA, truly one of the best. So you would see people go into the Wharton MBA really just like, cool, I'm going to go and have fun for 2 years, and then I'm going to wind up at McKinsey. And that was pretty much what happened because it was a Wharton MBA. So yes, they learned a lot of good things, but the MBA students didn't have to think too much about their career if they didn't want to, because there was going to be people waiting for them to graduate to hire them. And that was not the case for us. We had to really claw and fight to create the roles that we ultimately had. Pretty much all of the people, except for those who were already applying behavioral science, had to really not only decide where do we want to go, but how do we create that. In my case at Microsoft, it took me about a month to 2 months talking with them, pretty much doing free consulting, which I think we talked about in the PETS, which has its pros and its cons. For me, I was a student, and so I had the time at least. Now I'm not as apt to do something like that, but contributed about a month, 2 months of working with them, building out decks, thinking through what it would look like to build a behavioral science team. And that was enough to convince them. But that only was possible because I decided I really wanted to go into tech and do behavioral science in tech. And then B, I fought to go and find connections. And it was just a lucky connection through the program that happened to introduce me to the team that then I started the conversation with. So this all being said, MBDS program is one of the strongest master's programs that someone can do in a behavioral science field. Yet, even that program doesn't have solid connections to immediately drop someone in a job. And so that made me realize it is very difficult to break into this field, even if you're very dedicated to it. And so it seems like right now, the luck and skill mixture, we'll say, is a little out of whack, that it's more luck that you find the right connections and that you just happen to be at the right place at the right time, than it is skill that you really know what you're doing. And I hope to change that. I hope to ultimately help build pipelines so people can go build the skills. And then when companies or consulting firms or whatever organizations decide they need an applied behavioral scientist, they will know where to go, where they currently know if they need an MBA, they can go to Wharton, they can go to Harvard, et cetera. So.
Got it. We got to work on the length of your answers, man. We got to shorten this stuff down. I can't ask any questions. So feeding back what I'm hearing, it sounds like what you're saying is, hey, the trade organization emerged from, in order for businesses to effectively hire, like the reason you hire MBAs is because there's a core set of skills that any MBA coming from an MBA program is going to have. They're going to be able to build a financial model. They're going to be able to do some strategic, they have a set of things that they're going to know. There isn't that same thing for behavioral scientists. And so for you, the trade organization was about creating that rigor, right? That sense of here are the things that every behavioral science will know, so that when you're hiring, you can be confident about sort of okay, anybody who's come from, whether it's LSE or Penn or wherever, come through one of these recognized programs, even without interviewing them, I would know they have these sets of skills. Is that right?
Exactly.
Got it. And so that in some ways explains the pivot away from community, right? Community doesn't necessarily help that become true unless, of course, it's a community of people doing the hiring, right? I want to double click on that for a second, because you said, hey, I feel like you made a I love when people make potentially controversial statements. You said, I feel like of all the things, the most saturated right now is community. Say a little more about that.
Yeah. I say that because I think one of two things. A, it is in some ways, and it's another controversial statement, but saying it from experience. But I I believe that building community is the easiest aspect of what needs to be done to charter out a future pipeline for applied behavioral scientists. And I say that just because, like, at the end of the day, what is more fun? What is easier to get people subscribed to? What is changes so only we can turn the recording on and off?
I can't. I have bugged Val about it. Whoever's doing that, stop it or I'll kick you out. I'll just
Not have it be shut off. That'd be great. Um, so to conclude my answer, this one was going to be Turks, I promise you too, but this all got me excited. So the I think it's the simplest part because it's what gets people excited. You tell them, hey, you want to meet other people that are going to be doing similar things to you? Yes. You want to help build an event, put together a conference, put together a meetup? Yes. That was where APSA got the most excitement. I mean, at one point, our working group had 80 people, and a lot of them were contributing to trying to build events, resources, etc. But as soon as we said, okay, now we're going to start to work on those standards, we're going to have to really sit in a room, review a bunch of documents, ask for feedback, review that document, refine, etc. Next week, later on, those sort of things. And that's just, so I think community building is the easiest. And therefore, that is one of the big areas that are being built out. It's not easy. When you're looking at the full spread of tasks that are needed to really define our field, I think that's one of the easiest.
got it. So again, repeating back what I'm hearing, the promoting pressures for community are very high and the inhibiting pressures are very low. Do we know how to get people together? Yeah, absolutely. Is it fun? Absolutely. Right. Getting people to agree on standards, as one of the people who has looked at your standards and left comments, right? Like, it's hard to get people in this field to agree on what it is because everybody has their own, well, I don't want this to be left out, or I don't want that to be left out, or I do want to leave that out, or I do want to, because you're here and the heads of the other industry foundations are not, right? There's a whole bunch of sort of trade foundations that kind of came about at the same time, but with very different ideas of what the bar was going to be for being an applied behavioral scientist. And look, everybody on the call knows my bias, which is if you're doing the work of behavioral science, you are a behavioral scientist. I'm not interested in whether or not you have a PhD in it or whatever. That's not relevant for me. But there's some people, their trade organizations sort of say, hey, PhD or bust. There's another one that has like masters or bust, right? Like you have to have masters or above. Where are you drawing the line? Why are you drawing the line? Tell me a little bit about sort of, and you don't have to speak for the organization because obviously there's more than just you there. Like for yourself, where do you sort of draw the line? If who if they came up to you and said, I'm a behavioral scientist, would you go, I don't know that I agree with that?
Now that's a tricky question.
Doesn't have to be, sorry, I don't mean a real name. Don't blame a person. No real name. But I mean, what kind of person?
Yeah. So first of all, just want to call out, I appreciate you calling it out. I'm speaking for myself. I have been part of APSA since its inception, so you'll see a lot of our language and I mean, I'm constantly pushing for my beliefs, so you'll see that through what we do. But I also have stepped back and am more of an advisor than I am leading it right now. We've got a great team of people who are actually leading it. So I am not speaking for APSA. I'm speaking for myself through all this. This being said, I think that the first part of your answer of like education, I really like to highlight when I talk about standards, I am not talking about education. I am not talking about experience. I'm talking about knowledge, skills, and abilities. If you have ever been into like industrial organizational psychology, that was I focused some of my undergrad on that. That was like before behavioral science. That's where I thought I was going to go. And so I think that my mind just thinks a lot in that realm of just it's not the degrees, it's not the jobs, it is what does a person know, knowledge, what can they do, skills, and then, or I guess that's actually abilities. And then, yeah, we'll just call them skills and abilities. I can't, I'm not an IO psychologist. Now, this being said, what I don't think an applied behavioral scientist is, and in our standards when they come out, there's going to be at two levels. I don't want to go too much into it. Again, speaking more of how I look at it than what the final document will say. There's going to be users, and then there's going to be applied behavioral scientists. I think an applied behavioral science user or an associate or somewhere around that line is anyone who uses behavioral science as a specialization. So I know great product managers who are building behavioral science products who have never sat in a formal class, who have never even read the full nudge or what some of these books, but they still have a lot of the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to weave behavioral science concepts into the products they're building. Same with UX designers, same with marketing people. These are people who are not applied behavioral scientists, but they're using it as a specialization. And for them, I think the bar is relatively low on what they need to have to be able to be an associate. Now, the second piece is practitioners. And that I think the bar is actually set higher. And these are people that beyond just being able to do basic experimentation, being able to use mixed methods of research, so getting both qual and quant research, and then they need to really understand not just, okay, I know how to build a nudge, but really taking that full pipeline of how to develop an intervention that is effective at changing behavior that you're trying to change. So again, user, low bar, really just being able to have surface level understanding of how to apply some of these concepts. I think a lot of people fall into this bucket. But then to be an actual practitioner, you really need to have deep knowledge in the area, really understand, biases, heuristics, social norms, nudges, habits, habit formation, those sort of things. Plus, you need to be able to actually take those concepts and apply them in a refinable way using some sort of process where you're building an intervention that can be tested, is tested, refined, and then scaled. So two separations there. Pause there.
Yeah. So it sounds what I'm hearing is you can, in some of the cavalcade of, well, what is behavioral science and who's a behavioral scientist? There are a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about it, but they're on different places on their journey. And so what you want to do is create a category where you're saying, okay, if you're interested, there's a place for that interest, right? And we want to recognize that interest and we want to honor that interest, but it doesn't automatically make you, capable of doing this thing, in a full environment, right? And so you're saying there's a set of skills where if I was hiring somebody, right, because it goes back to where this thing all started, right? Your ability to sort of hire people in a confident way. An enthusiast may not have those things, right? One of the things I think is really interesting, and we go back to the Penn program, which, anytime you're the first at something, you get widely criticized. And so I know that there's been a lot of different things. One of the things that has come out of it, rather like MBA programs, is it's almost like the population looks a lot like people who would normally be in an executive MBA and some who would be in a standard MBA, right? So meaning we have some people who came right out of undergrad or with very little work experience. And then you have some people who have 20 years of work experience and are pivoting into behavioral science or want to learn more about behavioral science, who typically would get bled off into an executive MBA program, which has a little bit of a different sort of flavor. So there might be this sort of 2x2, right? Which is, from sort of interested to I've led projects, right? This is actually, I think, what we use in the directory, right? Is sort of the like interested to led, interested, participated, trained, led, to the like student all the way over to executive, right? I have tons of experience, because you could be a 15-year executive who's interested in behavioral science, right? And then you could be a 2-year associate who's led behavioral science projects. And those are really different constellations of things.
I love the framework. Yeah. If you want to co-author an article with that one.
No, but I think that's what you're expressing. I mean, I think what you're saying is, hey, as a standards body, we're interested in the level of knowledge, skills, and abilities, not necessarily experience. It's not about 2 years versus 15 years in terms of executive experience. It's about experience specifically, or skills specifically related to this thing that is behavioral science.
Yeah, 100%. And I will caveat that with saying, I do think that real world experience is very important for those knowledge, skills, and abilities. And maybe if I'm trying to recall my IO back, like the early IO education I got, I believe that the difference between skills and abilities is actually being able to apply it in the right setting. And that is very important, because it's one thing to say, I know how to build a great survey. Okay. Then it's another thing to say, I know how to deploy a great survey. And I think that those are actually very different. And I've built great surveys that have gotten terrible response rates. I had one that even people emailed me back and said, I'm not going to fill this out. I don't like how the questions are phrased. It did exactly what it was supposed to. It categorized people based on their self-determination, or self-determination continuum. I think it was a very well written survey, but it was terrible for the target audience I was sending it to. And so I had the skill. I did not have the ability there. And so I do think real world experience is important, but I don't think that 15 years of experience is important, to your point, that it is just having some experience. And the last thing I'll say is I do agree with the MBDS program. I think that is one of the challenges that they have, is that they have this spread of people who are some direct out of their bachelor's, have no real world experience, are interested, maybe even have a lot of excitement for the field and have done some small projects. But then you're combining that with an executive from somewhere that has a great ability at deploying some things, but that they may not even have that same level of understanding of the field. So I agree with your 2x2 matrix, actually, of just trying to look at assessing somebody on kind of the field, we'll say, of these, I don't even know what we would call it, but I think that the MBDS program has people across that whole continuum, 2x2 matrix. And so it makes it really hard for them to build a curriculum that wrangles everybody together and pushes them forward. So gets them into their next step.
Yeah, I think Liz has a question there. Liz, if you look at the very bottom, there's a little comment thing where you can raise your hand and we'll call on you, because I think you do have a question. I'll make it even more complicated, Connor. So now we've gone from a univariate scale to a we've got two orthogonal spectrums. Do you think there's one kind of behavioral scientist? There's been a lot of conversation about like sort of quant versus qual, or sort of strategy heavy versus more experimentation heavy. Do you sort of think about, how do you see this pattern of knowledge, skills, and abilities in terms of, are people, is it T-shaped, right? People have a deep specialization and then broad horizontal interest. Like, what do you think the shape of sort of this constellation of skills is? Because, you could be a maximalist and you could say, well, you're only a behavioral science if you can do absolutely everything, right? You can do quantitative, you can do qualitative, you can run experiment, you can do all of this stuff. But then the field becomes diminishingly small. Where do you sort of sit on the like specialization within behavioral science spectrum?
It's a good question, and I like the frameworks that you've developed. I think that you've added some definition to the different roles. I don't know if I've honestly really built out a strong opinion. If I were to just give you kind of off the cuff how I look at it right now, is I think that so first of all, when I talk about the users and the practitioners, or I actually think per our last meeting with AFSET, it's going to be associates and practitioners. So I'm going to try to stick to that language. Personally, again, Connor, 100% on this one. I think that it's like a 90-10 spread, or at least that's my vision. So for every 9 associates, there's only 1 actual applied behavioral scientist practitioner. And beyond that, I haven't thought too much about the differentiation. What I do believe is that, and I'm talking to a company right now, actually, they have a UX team of 45 people, and then they have a behavioral science team of 1 right now, and they're hiring a second one. And that's, I honestly actually think that's fine. Like, I think that maybe they need to hire 2 or 3 more to really build it out, but that 1-10 ratio or 1-9 ratio is fine. Because I think that there's only so many projects that behavioral scientists should be on that really are going to give them the opportunity to provide enough impact that they can justify their jobs. And then again, for those that don't know my background, I got laid off. I was in a behavioral science, like leading a behavioral science team at a startup, and all my funding, including my role, got cut. And so, call me jaded, but I do think that, and they had a UX team of about 6, I think. And so I think that the BeSci UX already has a difficult job proving its worth. I think that behavioral science, especially when embedded in UX, is actually even harder to prove one's worth. And so I'm walking myself down a path that I don't have a very declarative point on, but I think that my overall, what I'm trying to make the mark of is that I think that the spread of people who should have behavioral science skills is huge. I think that it can span most departments. But when it comes time to actually hiring a behavioral scientist, I think that role should be more of an architect, someone who can help make sure that all of the people are using behavioral science correctly, and then occasionally handling big scale projects themselves, things like personalization of interventions, other things like that. That would be where the time should be spent, rather than really having a huge team of behavioral scientists who are all kind of differentiated and trying to impact different departments of just trying to impact different departments. So I didn't give you a solid answer there, but hopefully that's something you can run with.
No, I liked it. I mean, I think there's a fascinating debate to be had about like, are those 40, behavioral scientist goes and works there. Do those 45 UX researchers become behavioral scientists with enough training? Like, what does that look like? What is the path? What you might be saying is, hey, there's going to be a few behavioral science leaders, and then they're going to organize these other resources in a new and different way. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to conceptualize it.
I'll say this. I think, and again, I give you a soundbite if you want. I think it'd be presumptuous. I'm saying that correctly. To say, there we go. Thank you. To say that every UXer would want to become a behavioral scientist, or every PM, or every, I think that there's a lot of people who are like, no, I want to be a user researcher, but I'm excited to have a specialization in behavioral science. Or like one of my best articles I've written, I think, is that I talk about it as sometimes you get a major in behavioral science, but I think most of the time you get a major in a different department and then a minor in behavioral science.
So there's a pointy question from I love that soundbite. We'll clip it out for you. There's a pointy question from Liz. What do you think of GABs?
So background on it was we talked to them very earlier in their inception. This was when apps was still full steam with trying to build out a full community rather than more focused on standards approach at this point. And we had a good conversation. We talked about what our beliefs were, and theirs, I don't know if they still have this marketing. I haven't looked at their material in probably over a year at this point. So I don't want to speak for them today. But when we had these conversations, we agreed that we wanted to build something very open and build a pipeline for people to get certification, for people to find interest in the field and become better suited for it, or build their profile up to ultimately be a strong user or practitioner. Gabs, on the other hand, was more interested in creating a club for established behavioral scientists. And so that was a clear differentiator. And we couldn't reconcile that difference. And so we just agreed that we could run with it. I commend them. They had a vision at that point. We had a vision at that point. They have built a lot more than we have in that period of time. To my understanding, they do have a good group of members, and they have stuck to it. Like I don't even know if time's hard to tell these days, but I know last time I checked, they still required, I think you have to have a PhD or have been published in a top tier journal. They have like a set of requirements, at least they did, that seemed like they still were a very club-based organization. This is only for people who have really achieved a certain level of preeminence in the community, where our vision has always just been try to be as open as possible. So that's, but I mean, I think I've heard people who really like being a part of it, very excited when they got accepted. I've also heard people that joined and were like, it's just a bunch of people who I could have connected with elsewise and didn't find as much value. So I think that it's just like any other club, then that some people are going to love it and some people won't.
Love that. Liz, you asked Connor and not me, but I will give my own opinion because I will give my own opinion because I'll give my own opinion. This is a great thing about being the host of the show. so Connor, my understanding is that their current requirements are either a postgraduate qualification or proof of a significant contribution to the field of applied behavioral science. So theoretically, I, despite being a PhD dropout, would still qualify in that, like, hopefully I've done at least something significant in the field of applied behavioral science. Although it's interesting that, who can decide about that is an interesting thing. One of the things I will say, Liz, that I think is always interesting is, for any place, I'm always looking at who's involved, right? I mean, I think that who's involved tells you a lot about sort of what, what the organization stands for. And it's interesting, it is a very it remains, their board of advisors is all professors. I think the only person that's not there that's not a professor is Maya Shankar, who obviously, has done some great work. But like, it's a very academically focused organization. Whereas, if I look at their sort of founding members and board of advisors, I don't see anybody who's been a chief behavioral officer anywhere, right? Lots of consultants, but like no CBOs, right? It's very academically focused, right? More so than what we might think of as, the folks who have held these positions in fields. Now, that's sort of an interesting dichotomy, and I always sort of wonder about this as a field, why there's such a big distinction between, even Maya, she does the great work at the White House, she goes off to Google, and then we sort of never, she does the podcast and stuff, but like, there's been no giant, push forward by Google in behavioral science. It's interesting to me that where there's been this sort of advisor, there's people who sort of engage in things for a long period of time, where I'm not seeing how they're pushing the field forward. And so that, I think, is the part, and this is all love and respect to Maya. It's just I am a little bit mystified in some ways by where that sort of leaves us as a field if people aren't, advancing forward and moving. She's been Google a really long time. So I'm interested in sort of how some of that plays out over time. The chairman of GABS is Steve Martin, who is a CEO of a consulting company essentially. So if you think about, if we take Connor as the like prototypical behavioralscience.org person, and Steve Martin as the prototypical GABS person, there's a big difference between sort of, I've been inside of a giant company doing this work, and I run a consulting company that sort of sells services that are sort of vaguely behavioral science in nature. And I think maybe that's the place where all of this stuff, I do think, or at least I hope, I don't know, maybe this is a good question for Connor. In that you said, hey, at the beginning we talked to them, kind of decided that they were going a different direction we were going. It feels like some of the battle of who's going to like win the behavioral science space has died out a little bit. For a while there, it felt like there was like 8 competing organizations, and there was a little bit of a scrum to see like, all right, well, who's going to get the ball and who's going to do what and where the line's going to be and all those sorts of things. It feels like that's passed a little bit. Do you still feel like there's a lot of rivalry and a lot of sort of fractionalism within the field, or do you think it's coming back together? Where do you think we are in the like blooming out, going down, blooming out, going down set of things?
That's a good question. Yeah. I agree that there's not as much. I agree that I don't experience as much of that, but I also am not in the thick of it as I once was. I was hell-bent on building out something and building this amazing organization. And after 5 years of it, really, I stepped back about 7 months ago. It was because like I just had burned myself out, and between my wife constantly telling me like, you're doing this for free, and this is causing you more stress than your work is causing you, that you're actually paid for. And then recognizing myself that I had given a lot to trying to build it, and that ultimately in many ways I failed for the vision that I tried. And I'm not upset about it. I learned a lot, and I think that there is still a lot of great opportunity, and I plan to play a role in the future of it. But
well, wait. I want to double click on this because I love stories of failure. What would success have looked like for you? Like if you think that it wasn't what you wanted it to be, what's the gap? We're gonna get into a painful place here for Connor.
You see how my body language changed? Look at that. So I think that so at our peak, we had, like I said, about 80 people who were actually engaged in this. I mean, we still have a large listserv of people who have explained interest, but we were emailing those people monthly and keeping them updated. There was a woman named Leanna. I always butcher her last name. Actually, she changed her last name, so it's easier to find her. Lena Belcour, who was my co-partner. So I can't talk about ABSA during that time without talking about her, because we were like very strong partners in doing it. And then the other people were BSPA, the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. So Kate Wessels, Craig Fox, and Sim Sitkin. So I just want to call them out because while I was a significant leader of it, they were also significant leaders of it too. But I think that we got very ambitious because we had a lot of excitement, and we had 80 people who were showing up on calls and emailing us and would occasionally do work that would help us move forward. But and I think that my personal failure here, and I don't fault myself too much because I mean, I'm still relatively young, but I was even younger at that period, was that I didn't have the best executive organization skills. I didn't know how to organize 80 people. And so I let it become very federated and we had 6 working groups that each had their own leader. And that was a good decision on my part, but then I didn't do a good job managing those 6 people. And so we had, like, there was a great work stream, I think the biggest failure that we had that could have been a huge impact, but that I didn't see through. And I mean, I blame myself. I take responsibility. I also put some blame on other people for not following through with what they said. But we had like this huge ethics work stream that was going to culminate in this big, what are the ethical decisions that people need to make in the applied behavioral science field? People may remember there was this whole call for ethical ideas in the magazine, The Behavioral Scientist. We had a huge social media campaign around it. And then we got this great feedback, but through various systems, again, I take responsibility because I was at the helm, it just never materialized. We just never were able to actually turn it into what we thought that we would. And then that team, when that started to fail, the people that were underneath it just started to kind of branch off. And they were kind of like, okay, well, if this isn't happening, I don't think this whole thing's going to happen. And we actually had 5 groups ultimately do that. So we had 6 working groups, 5 had a big push, they didn't materialize, and so the people fell apart. And then everything just kept going downhill from there. The only one that stayed, and I'll say this, is the standards, and that was the one that I was directly responsible for. So it was like, again, I personally didn't manage it like an executive should have, where I focused too much of my attention on what was my baby at the time and not enough on the full organization.
So Connor, in other words, you acted like a young person, and you've learned from those things. What a shock. I mean, I think that this is one of the, if you look at your age and how, you graduated from MDBS and MBDS in when?
2019.
Right? So it's now 2023. That's a huge outsized impact for a very short time. I actually see it as, I hear you on the, we always wish things that had been bigger than they were or had gone a different way. But I mean, I think as a young person coming into the field, if I look at somebody like Connor, I say, hey, look, there's, this person has had a huge impact in just a few years. That's really inspirational, right? Like that's an opportunity. I keep kind of remind people, this is not a settled field, right? This is not, if you want to go into marketing and make a really big splash, it is highly unlikely in the course of 4 years that you will be able to like found a trade organization, make standards, have those, that doesn't seem as doable as it does in this like interesting nascent field of behavioral science. And I sometimes forget that, right? Because I've been at it from since I had hair that looked like yours, right? And so for me, it feels like it's been really long, but it feels, I think there's still very fertile possibility. Imagine that now you're my age, now you're old, like, and you could snap your fingers, like, where do you want the field to go? Like, let's future cast a little bit. If you could change one thing about the field, if you could, you're in charge, you're going to lead us. Where would you lead us? What do you think is the thing that will help us be the better place? You should note that you have some lovely comments on the side, appreciating your vulnerability and sharing that.
Thank you.
And I echo that sentiment. Where do you want us to go? Where do you want to lead us? Like, where do you see?
I think about this a lot, of especially through the lens of the standards. But if I'm being honest, and this is probably a very biased group, so I'm not speaking to this group specifically. I assume that this group, a lot of the people here really are dedicated to this field, especially if you're showing up at 8 a.m. if you're on the West Coast in America. But I think that we as a field need to really decide what is the right structure for how many behavioral scientists should be in an organization, and how we differentiate from more established fields. Because and in doing so, I think that someone needs to take the lead to really make the case for why more than one or two behavioral, maybe we'll say a team of 5 is the most that I personally can see justified at this point. I don't know Maya well. I respect her work significantly, but I do share your opinion. Like, and I don't think it's fair to just put it on one person, because I don't know if she wants to be that leader. But somebody who runs one of these big teams, I think Steve Wendell did one of the best jobs writing. I think he has 2 editions of his books. He's written a fair amount. But I mean, even him now, he's at Bucera, and it's just, there's not as much. What does it actually look like to run? He's one of the few people that not only ran a team, but then that team survived. I think Florent, who I see is on this call, is another person who ran a team and it survived afterwards. So I think people that have done that, because the majority of these teams, even you look at places like Walmart that had a great team in, like, I think 2017, 2018, then when the person left, it dissembled. A lot of the teams, that's what happens. And so for the people who have ran teams that have persisted post them leaving, I think that those people are going to be the greatest resources to understand what does it actually look like to create a team that persists value enough to survive and continue to thrive. And that information needs to get through the ecosystem so that people can decide, is what I'm doing right now, do I want it to be close enough to what a Florent did, or what a Steve did, or what one of these other people did, that I'm willing to take those risks, build those capabilities, do that type of work enough that I want to stay in this field, and then they can go and try to do it on their side. There has to be opportunities, which is a separate conversation, but I see your commented here, Florent. I'll after this monologue, I'll spin back. I know Florent pretty well, but I think that again, looking forward, what I really think we need to do is determine how we differentiate via value, and then from there determine what the proper structure looks like, because it's still very much experimental right now, and that experimentation is still yielding a high failure rate, which again is okay. But if we want to really establish ourselves as a field over the next decade, we need to learn from those experiments in some sort of collective way, so that we can iterate and build from there.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think one of the things the reason we've had 2 chats now, Connor, is I love that you say things that are pointy, because, we want something that reasonable people could disagree with, right? So, I've built those teams. I've watched those teams dissolve after I left, although I'm not sure that that's a bad thing in my articulation of the world, right? Like, I do want all 45 of those UX people to see themselves as behavioral scientists and come over into a behavioral science. Like, I think there is no UX that's not behavioral science. I mean, leaving aside usability testing and some other things that might be more in the operational, for those that don't know, I think of a business in three pieces, right? It's business, behavioral model, operational model. And between operations and business, operations and behavior, there are some things that kind of, you can have design that is about figuring out initially what we need to do. And then you can have design about like making a design language and making sure it's consistent across everything and all of those sorts of things. So there's lots of things. There is UX that could live on that side, more on the usability side. That's very different than the, what the heck do we do in the first place version. So I think I have a very diffuse model of, behavioral science is good when we get everybody to focus on behavior and then use a scientific like process. That's very different than a like, hey, we should have some named behavioral scientists. It's so interesting, as you know, I'm working in the background on this. The next thing that'll come out for me is a hiring guide. And, one of the things in the hiring guide is job descriptions. And all of them have like behavioral science names in the 6 roles that I conceptualize. But they all have alternative titles where I'm like, could be called a user researcher. And you could use this, you don't have to say the word behavioral. You could just use this, call it user researcher. But this is how you should hire user researchers. This is what a user researcher look like. That's very different than hey, we should have 1 to 5 to 50 or however many you think is right, assigned behavioral scientists running around in something. And to your point, I love that we're still experimenting with this. We'll find out which, and maybe there's no one answer. Maybe it's pasta sauce and we need more than one version of this thing, right? To do the right thing. We had, I think the last guest we had was Jesse Jeffkowski looking at Indeed, right? Which has much more of a like 1 or 2 person focused behavioral science, alongside these much larger models. And I think they're up to maybe 3 behavioral scientists or something at this point for an organization the size of Indeed. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out. And that hopefully, I worry sometimes that, you've done so much work, you tried really hard, and there are ways that you see that as a failure. And that failure can make us feel very cynical, right? And hopefully talking to other behavioral scientists reminds us that actually there's a lot to be hopeful for, right? If what we view is this chaos as the creative chaos that comes from experimentation, and that we eventually will coalesce around some sort of right model or right-sized model, or however you want to say that, there's reasons to be hopeful because lots of experiments are being run. You are currently interviewing for some gigs and things. Ooh, that one triggered some people, right? We got hybrid models, decentralized models. It's like we should do a whole one on just like centralized versus decentralized teams. I should get Steve to talk about it. You're interviewing for roles right now. What are you seeing from the field? How are people, when people talk to you and come to say, you're a recruited person. So rather than applying, people come to Connor and say, hey, I want to hire the Connor. You're an in-demand asset. What are, when people come and talk to you about like why they want to hire a Connor, what are you hearing about why people want you?
Just to comment previously, I appreciate it. I do actually, in the last 4 years, my level of, cynicism isn't the right word per se, but maybe pessimism is a little bit better. But my overall skepticism that the field will become its own department and the same tier as a UX, as a data science, something like that, has definitely grown. So I just want to call that out. And it's definitely been influenced by my experience. So I appreciate that call out, and then, but the other thing I want to say is that I think you and I are actually in very similar lines of thinking. You just might, if I'm understanding you correctly, you just might actually see people beginning to see themselves as behavioral scientists, where I see them as not seeing themselves as behavioral scientists, even though they are ultimately applying behavioral science in the work they're doing. So I just wanted to call that out. That I think we're.
But isn't that the devil's greatest trick, right? Convincing people he never existed, right? Like if a UX person is doing behavioral science but doesn't think of themselves as a behavioral scientist, in a forced choice world, right? Where we have one world where people call themselves behavioral scientists and it's small and it's narrow, but not many people do it. And do it here, I mean behaviors and outcome sciences process. Or everybody is using behaviors and outcome science as a process, and it's so normalized that no one calls themselves a behavioral scientist because it's just the way everybody does something. Wouldn't that be great?
Like, that's actually exactly, and that is more of where I'm pushing towards, is that I see these small teams of behavioral scientists doing the work that's needed to get everyone kind of trained up or upskilled. So everybody keeps doing their job. They're just doing it in a better way. It is more of where my mind is at. So let me answer your question. I know we're close on time. Also, I just want to call. Thank you, Florent, for sharing, and yeah, I appreciate your perspective. Thank you for letting me choose on you, even though we're never agreed to it. So I think that one of the biggest things that I see is that a lot of companies still don't know what they want. That it's just like, I have heard behavioral science. I'm excited about it. I wrote an article that I need to repackage because it has not gotten as much traction as I think. As much as I reference it, either I just really like it and I'm referencing a lot and finding ways, or I just need to repackage it in a way that makes more sense. But the underlying argument of it is that you can't really do good behavioral science work if you don't have some fundamental established and huge caveat on this is good behavioral science work in a digital environment. So just big caveat. That's where majority of my career is. Most of the time, take what I say with that caveat, because that is where, at least when I'm talking about actual work, you can't do good behavioral science work without some established foundations like passive data collection, being able to see what people are doing on your system, having the ability to do experimentation, A/B testing such things, feature flighting, so you can try different features, etc. There's a whole list of things like that. And I am surprised how many teams have come to me and said, I am interested in doing behavioral science work. And then when I go down that checklist, they don't have those basic foundations. Like it's really hard to do good behavioral science work if you've never tried to talk to your customer and or you've never collected any sort of data, or you have no way of being able to do some of these very foundational things. And so so that's where I'd say there's still a fair amount of companies that have not done that, or that are just jumping straight to, oh, I want to do behavioral science work. Another trend that I'm seeing, this is more in the UX space, but is a good thing for us, is that VCs are beginning to want to have companies pull in research earlier in their development. Right now, a user researcher generally isn't hired until about 200-300 people, in my opinion. I've heard other ones, but it's still generally in the hundreds before a researcher is actually hired. It seems like, at least in a consulting fashion, that research is getting pulled in earlier now. So that's a big one, because that means that the company's going to establish those foundations. So that's another trend that I'm seeing. And then I would say the last trend is that, and this is just I think that overall the research field has gotten hit in the sense that disproportionately researchers seem to have been laid off. And so compensation and leveling has dropped in just like the last 6 months. And I'm really surprised. I've gotten 2 quotes now of like, I was like, you're literally quoting me a third of what I was making. Like, and so like, this is exciting. I like what you're doing, but I just like, yes, the market's changed, but I don't think it's changed that much. So that's, I think, the other unfortunate reality that's facing right now.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that is behavioral science versus, sort of industry wide, whether or not digital salaries have just taken a massive hit as everyone has laid off everyone.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is, like any labor problem, right? Like, it's a scary contest between employers and employees about like who's going to blink first, right? If you can't hire anybody for the wages you offer, you have to raise those wages, and this is the sort of the weird nature of a capitalist situation. I have noticed the same thing, for what it's worth, that like, salaries are all over the place in terms of what people are expecting at really every level. As someone who helps people hire a lot of behavioral scientists, there's stuff, sort of, the senior stuff has gone in weird directions. The junior stuff has gone in weird directions. It's all sort of all over the map right now. Connor, I want to thank you for coming again. We wanted to get a second recording with you because we ran out of time last time and we didn't get to talk about all the things we want to talk about. I think this has been super helpful. I appreciate, as a going concern on the market of behavioral science, as people are sort of competing for your attention, and to hire you, I think it's good to hear, where you see that going. Since I think, wherever you land is a place where there might be more future behavioral scientists, whether it's 2 or 3, or whether it's the whole UX department suddenly thinks of themselves as behavioral scientists. We'll see. Thank you so much, Connor, for coming. We'll release the recording of this out into the world. Appreciate everybody for coming, and we'll see you for our next one very soon. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Matt. Cheers, everybody.